Welcome. My name is Robert Jaskowiak. I am an honorary consul of the Republic of Poland in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Some of you already know that Virginia is the cradle of American democracy. Just several miles south from here, we have Monticello, home of President Thomas Jefferson, the author of Declaration of Independence. Even closer, just few short miles from my home, there is Montpelier, home of President James Madison, the father of American Constitution, the first such document in the world. Virginia was also the first state that Poles and Lithuanians came to as early as 1609. They were the craftsmen and artisans, the workers who produced the first products shipped back to England. The very Polish and Lithuanian workers were also the first ones to go on strike. When the House of Burgesses, currently Virginia General Assembly, denied them the right to vote since they weren't English-born citizens, Poles won and obtained political and civil rights equal to English. So I find it very auspicious that this very idea to commemorate 230th anniversary of May 3rd Constitution of the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania originated here in Virginia, the birthplace of American democracy. May 3rd Constitution of the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania from 1791 was the first European constitution and second only to American in the world. Poland has built a long tradition of democracy through passing first religious freedom laws in Europe, protection of individual rights, and creation of the very first free union between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland, commonly known as the Crown or Korona, in Union of Lublin in 1569. When the May 3rd Constitution of 1791 was introduced, the once mighty and most powerful nation in Europe that at one time stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, was in the last stages of decline. The Commonwealth was economically devastated by countless military conflicts and lack of political strength due to corruption of its senators and foreign interference. The May 3rd Constitution was, as famous Polish philosopher Hugo Kołłątaj said, the last will and the testament of the expiring homeland. Currently, many of us are facing unprecedented challenges due to COVID-19. Number of our personal freedoms and constitutional rights are being restricted or violated. What lessons from history of Poland and May 3rd Constitution are still valid and important today? Let's find out by listening to a series of short interviews with a group of diverse yet fascinating people. Let the journey begin. Thank you.
The significance of the May 3rd Constitution for Poland and Europe in 1791 cannot be understated. It was a revolutionary progressive document imbued with the ideals of the Enlightenment that sought to modernize the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and to serve the good of the entire nation. The Constitution, signed by the elites of society in the Great Sejm, introduced a number of reforms, including a separation of powers manifested in a democratic constitutional monarchy, the broadening of the term citizen to include peasants and commoners, and the establishment of a bicameral legislature in which the king, presiding over the Senate, had one vote, equal to that of an ordinary senator. Importantly, and as many may already know, it was the first such constitution adopted in Europe and the second in the world after the US Constitution signed in 1787. The reforms, though successfully implemented, were abolished following the partitions of Poland by the neighboring Russian, Prussian and Austrian empires during which Poland disappeared from the map of Europe for 123 years. Although its history may be short, the document was transformational for demonstrating to the world the Commonwealth's respect for the dignity of all societal classes.
Dear friends, I'm very happy to welcome this important event on the occasion of 230th anniversary of the Constitution of May 3rd, 1791. In recent years in Lithuania, there was a growing interest in what this constitution meant to our nation, to our country, and to a wider region. That led us to realize how visionary and revolutionary the constitution was in its day. Not only was it the first written constitution in Europe and the second constitution in the world after the US, we see now that it started some very bold and determined steps on the road to values that we consider self-evident today, like the separation of powers, or a notion that the nation is not just landlords, but a wider number of people. It signaled the idea that it was a duty of all to protect their country. That feeling of obligation to protect our nations is still something that burns in millions of hearts of Lithuanians and Poles. It remains an integral part of who we are. And the fact that both countries celebrate the birth of this constitution today is also a reflection how close Lithuania and Poland have become as friends and allies. An important proof of this closeness is also a common resolution by the Lithuanian Seimas and both houses of the Polish parliament that marks the anniversary. The resolution stresses that the constitution laid the foundations of the political identities of the nations that followed the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So let me once again thank the organizers, and in particular the Polish Embassy in Washington, D.C., the Honorary Consul of Poland in Virginia, and our good friend Steve Olejasz from the Friends of Kostuszko. I want to wish you a very successful event. Thank you.
Although the signing of this monumental document may seem like distant history to us now, we continue to honor the Constitution for standing as a testament to our historic struggle for independence. During the 123 years of partitions between 1795 and 1918, it gave hope to the Polish people that their nation's sovereignty would be restored. So too was the case during the communist era after World War II, when the regime banned the observance of the May 3rd holiday. For many years, there were no national ceremonies to mark the occasion, and attempts to celebrate it ended with arrests and persecution. In 1990, after communism fell and Poland regained its sovereignty, the pre-war tradition was restored and May 3rd was reproclaimed a national holiday. For many of us who lived through that era, the observance of the occasion itself was and is a declaration of our resolute Polish spirit and the love for a nation that recognizes the inherent value of its citizenry. Now, 3 decades after democratization in Poland, we continue to celebrate the Constitution for both its declaration of sovereignty and its modernizing impulse that drives Poland to this day. We return to this ideal as we build an ever more innovative Poland and strengthen our relationships with our allies. We continue to be reminded that the legacy of the May 3rd Constitution cannot be taken for granted, and that we must remain vigilant and react decisively to defend the democratic ideals that were enshrined in it in 1791. Current events in Ukraine and Belarus, for example, show how important it is to stand up to upheavals. I am convinced that the challenges we face will be resolved through multilateral cooperation, inspired by the promise of change, freedom and progress embodied by the May 3rd Constitution.
Good day to you. I'm Mark Fountain, the Honorary Consul of the Republic of Poland in Raleigh, North Carolina. As an historian who is not Polish by family, but yet an historian of Poland, I view it as a rare privilege, a great privilege, to have been invited to give a short statement on the continuing value of the Constitution of May 3, 1791. The Constitution of May 3 stands as the second oldest written constitution in the world, after that of the United States, but more than 4 months earlier than that of France. As such, it commands respect and relevance on the basis of its antiquity alone. But it has much more to recommend it and earn the merit of rereading at any time. It was, at one and the same time, the product both of general European and American democratic thought of the 18th century and of purely Polish political circumstances and traditions. Much of it is recognizable to the average educated citizen of the West in this 21st century, and that which is peculiar to Poland becomes more understandable as we view it from the milieu of its creation. To demonstrate the relevance then and now, I like to show the interest shown in the United States in its progress. Already in mid-July 1791, a report of its having been passed was printed in Philadelphia, a tribute to the progress of news across the continent to London and thence to Pennsylvania, 9 weeks and 9 weeks only in transit. The report in the Gazette of the United States may have been short, a few curt sentences of time and place, but the import was keenly understood. From the easternmost outpost of Western civilization, Poland, to the westernmost outpost of Western civilization, the new United States, everyone was interested in and followed the progress of sovereignty, with increasing participation by wider and wider elements of the population. In the same Gazette of the United States, the new Constitution of Poland was printed in a very precise English translation beginning on September the 10th, 1791. It ran for several issues because it was too long for inclusion in the physical newspaper in one issue and had to be serialized twice a week for several weeks. Again, consider the feat of bringing this news to a broad urban public 4,000 miles away at the close of the 18th century. Here we have page 2 of that Gazette of the United States for September 10, 1791, and you will see that the Constitution occupies the place of most importance, the top left-hand corner of that particular newspaper page. And if we move even farther to an enlargement of it, you can see that it is a marvelous reproduction of the actual wording, very precise translation, of the Polish original. If we read it here, new Constitution of the Government of Poland, etc., etc., in the name of God and in the Holy Trinity, Stanislaus Augustus, by the grace of God, King of, and the will of the nation, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Russia, Prussia, Moscovia, Samogitia, etc., etc., together with the confederated states assembled in double number, to represent the Polish nation. So a marvelous beginning, which all of us are familiar with. So again, I emphasize the fact that this was done fewer than 4 months after the actual passage of the Constitution in Warsaw. I'm sure that the assiduous researcher will find similar reports in the papers of New York, Boston, certainly I think Richmond, Virginia, and Charleston, South Carolina. Poland was a leader, a pioneer in the quest for popular sovereignty. This distinction within Western political thought was the product of many years of Polish constitutional law and respect for fundamental human rights. From Paweł Wojtkiewicz at the beginning of the 15th century, through Wawrzyniec Koszlicki in the 16th century, through Stanisław Konarski in the middle of the 18th century. Here we see his book, his famous book, the first of 4 volumes in this edition, O skutecznym sposobie, published about 1760. Through all of these, Polish political thought had progressed along with and often ahead of the sovereign nations of far Western Europe. So the outpouring of praise and excitement in 1791 should come as no surprise and serve as a model of thought and deliberate procedure for today. This was in the 3rd year of the famous 4-year Sejm, so very deliberate. The enthusiasm of Edmund Burke, the English conservative, can serve as an example. Let us read here. No, not one man incurred loss or suffered degradation. All, from the king to the day laborer, were improved in their condition. Everything was kept in its place and order, but in that place and order everything was bettered. To add to this happy wonder, this unheard of conjunction of wisdom and fortune, not one drop of blood was spilled, no treachery, no outrage, no system of slander more cruel than the sword, no studied insults on religion, morals, or manners, no spoil, no confiscation, no citizen beggared, none imprisoned, none exiled. The whole was effected with a policy, a discretion, a unanimity, and secrecy such as have never been before known on any occasion. But such wonderful conduct was reserved for this glorious conspiracy in favor of the true and genuine rights and interests of men. Happy people, if they know to proceed as they have begun. Aren't those wonderful words to close with? Happy people if they know to proceed as they have begun. We can hope that we, in the same, that the same can be said of us after some more 230 years, that we have done as well as the Poles did in 1791. Thank you very much.
2021 marks the 230th anniversary of the Constitution of 3 May of the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania. Both the Polish Parliament and the Lithuanian Parliament have issued proclamations in honor of this great event. So, why was the Constitution so important when it was written, and what's the legacy of the Constitution today? I think you go back and you look at the time when the Constitution was written and put into force. In 1791, the Constitution of 3 May of the Commonwealth came into effect. It became the 2nd oldest constitution in the world, after that of the United States. So as the writers were putting this into force, they were clearly influenced by the U.S. Revolution and Constitution, and the French Revolution and the French Constitution that was being written at about this same time. Clearly, these writers were imbued with the Enlightenment, the ideas of the Enlightenment, and how the Enlightenment should work in written government. So the idea of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism, defined simply as the limitation of the state by law. And in many ways, constitutionalism at this time was important because a written constitution, obviously very unique if this became only the 2nd one in the world, and this was opposed to absolutism. And absolutism was really what we had seen in Europe, particularly where the Commonwealth was concerned. It was surrounded by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, these monarchies, these strong empires where they tended to be more absolute. The power resided in the monarchy. So, as the writers of the Commonwealth were putting the Constitution into force, they were thinking about these things and how they were going to do it. So it was very unique at the time. So the Constitution has many enlightened ideals, very liberal for its time. It considered individual rights. It reformed the government and the structures of government, the parliament system at the time. It looked to expand rights. And one of the important things is it extended government protection to the peasantry. And ultimately, the Constitution established a constitutional monarchy. So as this constitutional monarchy came into force, the surrounding powers of the Commonwealth were not happy about this. It would obviously be seen as a threat. About 20 years earlier, Russia, Prussia, and Austria had partitioned part of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania lost a significant part of its landmass and its population. So after the Constitution of 3 May comes into force in 1791, within 2 years, there's another partition, additional fighting, and there's another partition. And then ultimately, a few years later, 1795, the final partition comes into play, and the Commonwealth is wiped from the map. So, looking back at the Constitution, I think a very good analysis has said the Constitution did not save the state, it did not save the Commonwealth, but it did save the nation. In this case, 2 nations, Poland and Lithuania. So, you take what was important of this Constitution, and I think those ideals were embodied by the people, were embodied by the 2 nations that were joined together and that put this Constitution into force. So throughout their history, going forward from that period, I think those ideals were very fundamental, particularly during the communist era. So during the communist era, Poland, under communist government, part of the Eastern Bloc, Warsaw Pact, and Lithuania actually invaded, subsumed as part of the Soviet Union. When communism comes to an end, the Soviet Union falls, both of these countries, both of these nations of Poland and Lithuania become free, vibrant democracies. They put back into practice those fundamental beliefs that were embodied in the Constitution of 3 May. Both countries, when they develop their democracies, they also integrate closely to the West. They want to become part of the European Union and part of NATO, and that's probably an important part that they learned during the time of the Constitution, was you had to have strong defense. And so both of these countries joined NATO. They're good NATO members today. So looking back, I think the Constitution was very important. I think the Constitution's ideals continue. And today, the Constitution is a point of friendship between Poland and Lithuania. So I think that keeps their already strong ties, good relations, even stronger. So as we celebrate the 230th anniversary of the Constitution, let's hope we keep these ideals in mind, and I think we'll have a good future for Poland and Lithuania, and these ideals are spread throughout the world.
The Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791 is usually celebrated as a symbol of the Polish nation's desire for independence and sovereignty. That's understandable, given that soon afterwards it was overthrown after just 15 months by a Russian invasion, and the second and third partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth followed in 1793 and 1795. The power of such a symbol is apparent, for example, from the demonstrations against martial law and the suppression of solidarity on the 3rd of May 1982. But now, in 2021, it is more than 30 years since Poland and Lithuania recovered their sovereignty and independence. What is the attraction of celebrating such an aspiration in a situation when independent and sovereign statehood has once again, fortunately, become normal? I think we need to go back to the context of the Constitution of the 3rd of May. For most of the 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been subjected to the hegemony of the Russian Empire, and the leash was being tightened under Catherine II. But then came an opportunity when the Empress of Russia was occupied by a war against the Ottoman Empire in the south and against the Kingdom of Sweden in the north. She was also conflicted with the Kingdom of Prussia and with Great Britain. And so in the autumn of 1788, the Polish-Lithuanian Parliament, or Sejm, took the opportunity to cast off the guarantee by the Russians of the Commonwealth's form of government, which was designed to keep it weak and to frustrate all the efforts at reform that had been building up for a couple of generations. This meant that the Commonwealth's Parliament, its Sejm, exercised the sovereignty that was necessary to begin the task of reforming the form of government, and there was much to reform. At the same time, it sought to preserve those homegrown republican virtues and that cult of liberty which made a Polish-Lithuanian citizen. A compromise among the political elite was necessary between the king, Stanisław August Poniatowski, on the one hand, and his republican opponents on the other. And they came together in the Constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791, which set out the path to a better future, one based on evolutionary social change. The Commonwealth was still a society of estates, of nobles, of burghers, peasants, Jews, and others. But the Constitution explicitly made all inhabitants of the Commonwealth part of the nation, including the peasants as its most numerous and useful part. Everyone could expect the protection of law and government, irrespective of their religion or language. The Commonwealth would move towards a situation in which everyone could expect some personal security, liberty, and property, and with property and education would come a greater participation in the political process. This was a path fit for the 19th century, a far better 19th century than the one that actually occurred. The form of government featured the tripartition of powers, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, carefully balanced together. And this meant that the Commonwealth would be able to move forward in the spirit of orderly freedom. This was a threat to the neighbouring absolute monarchies. Catherine II was especially outraged by the idea that the serfs of the Russian Empire, as soon as they stood on Polish soil, would become free, able to go to a town to learn a trade, or to contract with a landowner in order to manage a farm in return for their labour, on the basis of a contract. This was not to be borne. She fumed both that the Constitution had bestowed absolute power on the King of Poland and also compared it to revolutionary democracy. Both, of course, were exaggerations, but they show the sense of threat felt by those neighbouring absolute monarchies. And that is why the Russian army invaded the Commonwealth in the spring of 1792, helped by a very small number of traitors, for the great majority of Polish-Lithuanian citizens supported the Constitution. And so that is the testament of the Constitution for the future, not so much an aspiration to sovereignty, but as a demonstration of the vast potential of the Commonwealth. What could it do with that sovereignty? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Blanka Rosenstein. I would like to share with you my personal thoughts on the continuity of freedom as expressed in the American and Polish constitutional experience. When I was a little girl growing up in the interwar Poland, we proudly celebrated the Constitution Day every May the 3rd. The Polish Parliament enacted the Constitution on that day in 1791. The Poles ushered in the new basic law for the nation to accelerate much needed freedoms. Alas, Poland's predatory neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, conspired to terminate the reform movement. Using the introduction of the Constitution of May 3rd as a pretext, Russia attacked and crushed Poland, doing away with the new basic law. Soon, the three powers colluded to partition and destroy the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth altogether in 1792 and 1795, a rather lengthy process. Polish state henceforth disappeared from the map of Europe for 123 years, yet its constitutional legacy endured. In that context, we learned that the legal instrument of May 3rd, 1791, was the world's second written constitution ever after the American one, which was written on 4th March 1789. We were told that the American document inspired the Polish one. However, we also heard that the echoes of Polish freedoms were to be found in the United States constitutional experience. Just how much that was the case, I would learn only much later in America. When I came to this country about 65 years ago, I was amazed about the respect that Americans of all walks of life paid to our Constitution. The conservatives in particular stress originalism. The original intent of the founding fathers should dictate the interpretation of basic law. This sort of approach was rather unknown on the conservative side in Europe. In fact, the continental rightists tended to dismiss any written constitutional instrument as an insignificant piece of paper that would be amended or destroyed at will. The real constitution, according to them, should be written in the heart. It sprang from God, it was organic, and it came from precedent and not abstractions. Such giants of the continental reactionary monarchism as Joseph de Maistre, Luis de Bonald, Juan Donoso Cortes, and others were in complete agreement on that. There was one significant exception. The father of modern evolutionary conservatism, Edmund Burke, agreed in rejecting innovation and abstraction in favor of tradition and precedent. Nonetheless, Burke enthusiastically embraced the American experiment, and he positively cheered the Polish Constitution of May 3rd. Both instruments for him were the essence of tradition and patriotism. I could not concur more. I always wanted to share the good news about the affinity between the American and Polish constitutions. An opportunity arose in 1989 when I sponsored a conference on comparative constitutionalism at the Miller Center of the University of Virginia. One enduring product of the conference was a collection of essays by Kenneth Thompson and Red Ludwikowski, Constitutionalism and Human Rights in America, Poland, and France, a bicentennial colloquium at the Miller Center. The conference also attracted a panel of distinguished scholars and group of enthusiastic participants. One of the latter, Adam Zamoyski, an United States-born and British-reared historian, regaled us with the fascinating commentary, a codicil, really an American constitutionalism. Namely, he claimed that, as far as U.S. Constitution, Thomas Jefferson himself was inspired directly by the Polish Renaissance thinker Wawrzyniec-Goślicki, who was first to introduce the idea of the tri-division of power, legislative, executive, and judiciary. Others believe that Goślicki trickled down to John Locke, who in turn informed Jefferson. Be it as it may, I thought the information most interesting. With a little help from my friends, I was able to locate and publish that particular treatise, Wawrzyniec-Grzymała-Goślicki, the accomplished senator, the Optimo Senatore, Miami, was published by American Institute of Polish Culture in 1992.
Why is it important to celebrate the May 3rd Constitution 230 years later? Well, it was one of the greatest political achievements and only second such written constitution after the US Constitution, which was ratified only 2 years earlier. The May 3rd Constitution also provided continuity to centuries of political and social traditions in Poland and gave hope, nurtured aspirations for independence for a country and a population and several generations of Poles who lived under foreign occupation during the times of partitions. That constitutional process and struggle for democracy in Poland may have also prevented autocratic governments in Europe from intervening in France's 1789 revolution. So that's another important fact to remember. It's also worth to remember that the May 3rd Constitution was translated to a number of languages, foreign languages, and served as the blueprint for Western politicians and philosophers throughout the 19th century. And of course, this was a document that was well ahead of its time, since absolute monarchies finally fell only in the aftermath of World War I. Today, of course, we do not have absolute monarchs, but we do witness an alarming rise of absolute dictatorships in countries such as Russia, Turkey, China, and North Korea. There are also other illiberal governments all the way across the world, from Southeast Asia to South America and to Central Europe, who routinely violate historic norms and constitutional principles that regulate given states' interactions with its citizens. The other thing worthy of remembering these days is that the tragic example of how the liberum veto procedures in Poland led to legislative paralysis and loss of independence. That's still valid today across the world. Legislative processes that are stymied by minorities in parliaments can, of course, lead to dysfunctional governance. Restrictions in voting laws, partisan gerrymandering, and disregard for clear and well-established facts in public discourse can lead to collapse of societies that are polarized around wedge issues and narrowly defined political interests. That would certainly sound familiar to those who were writing the May 3rd, 1791 Constitution. And just like 230 years earlier, we need enlightened debates within the political discourse. We must trust facts, not propaganda. We should cultivate the well-established principles in which democratic societies operate. History teaches us how to proceed. The May 3rd Constitution pointed a way not only for Poland in her hour of need, but also for the legions of forward-thinking politicians and philosophers elsewhere. And together with the US Constitution, it laid the foundations for modern societies and how to govern them. It is up to us today to preserve this gift, this precious gift our forefathers gave us, and to keep the flame of elective and enlightened democracy alive well into the 21st century. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about this important document on this important anniversary.